happy to have Patty here. It's been a little while since she's been here, and so she's going to talk about Arizona. Patty?
Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been several years, and it's just so exciting to be in a room full of people who are all interested in bioassessment. I mean, this just doesn't happen in my state, so thank you for having me. So I'm going to give you kind of the 30,000-foot view of our bioassessment program in Arizona in 10 minutes or less. I'm going to start in 2007. We received an EPA Regional Ecological Monitoring and Assessment Program grant to do a few different objectives. We're looking at the reach-wide monitoring protocol of EPA's program versus the riffle-based macroinvertebrate approach that we use in Arizona. And I did a comparison study and found the two approaches very similar using our Arizona index. So all of these projects were kind of in order for us to look at using the national river and stream protocols in Arizona with the biocriteria standard that we'd already established, and I'll talk about that next. The second objective we had was to do a pilot probabilistic monitoring approach, or use a randomized site selection and assessment approach, and we did that in our Little Colorado River Basin in Arizona with interesting results. And then a third objective was to try to improve our perennial stream map from which the randomized site selection happens. This is super important in Arizona, where 94% of our stream miles are intermittent or ephemeral, so we only have 4% perennial. And the historic hydrologic maps or original maps are vastly out of date and inaccurate. So that makes for a lot of recon trips where you're finding streams are dry, they're dry, they're dry. In the Western EMAP study, they found an 80% error rate in finding streams that were perennial to do monitoring. So we felt that we needed, in order to participate in the national river surveys and to adopt this probabilistic approach at the state level, that we really need to have better maps. So one of the things we did was hired USGS to come up with some predictive models for determining the status or flow regime status of streams across the state. So these are the three reports that came out of that REMAP grant. They're all available on the DEQ website if you want to find out more about how that analysis was done. So our biocriteria program, we started in the early 90s with my predecessor in 1992 doing some early reference condition work. It's taken us many years to get that reference condition established and develop biocriteria, which we finally did pass in our water quality standards rule in 2009. This was really a big goal for us, and we thought that after we got the standard established, that it would be just clear sailing to do 305B assessment reports and do 303D listings of impaired waters and get to actually doing TMDL studies and restore our streams. I mean, that's what water quality standards is all about, is finding out what's wrong and fixing it. We have not been able to get all that far. We developed an implementation procedures document for our standards. This has never been formally adopted within the agency, so I've had some internal roadblocks on getting documents. The implementation procedures is actually required for us to be able to do listings. So another thing that's required is our 305B assessment guidance and listing guidance is required to be in rule, in this impaired waters implementation rule, which we have basically had a rules moratorium in Arizona, which does not allow us to update this rule to include the new biocriteria standard and implementation procedures. So we're kind of at a standstill on the standards level, but we've been doing more on the assessment level. So here are a few of our assessment accomplishments. We've been able to upload our macroinvertebrate and habitat data to the EPA's Water Quality Exchange database in 2011. We've been participating in the National River Surveys. We were kind of late coming to the table with the National River Surveys, but we've now participated in the 2008-9 study and the current study. We did something like 11 streams this year, and we have another, I think, 15 next year. We actually have taken on this probabilistic approach as part of our monitoring strategy and completed our first report, and I'll talk about that a little bit more just this year. And then we also are doing a special study on the Wallow fire, which was the biggest fire in Arizona's history. So I'm going to talk more about that too. So our this first probabilistic assessment that we did in state, we actually used our macroinvertebrate monitoring protocols, which is a riffle-based approach, and the index of biological integrity. It's a multi-metric index that that we developed years ago, actually around the year 2000. We've been using that continuously, especially now that it's established in standards. We don't have an ODE index yet, but that's in the future. But we were able to do this first probabilistic assessment, found, like some other studies, 42% of stream miles biologically impaired. Reference condition is more like 28% are in actual good condition, 30% kind of intermediate. And the stressor graph shows canopy and habitat index, percent algae cover, connectivity. Those things are big stressors statewide, but the actual relative risk to the macroinvertebrates is the greatest for fine sediment and habitat, which is substrate condition. So we are doing this study on the Bear Wallow fire, which again is the biggest fire in our history. Over 500,000 acres burned. There were 500 miles, stream miles, perennial stream miles that were affected. We had 7 study sites in that area. There was also another fire, the Horseshoe 2 fire, that we were studying as well. 4 of those 7 sites had impaired IBI scores compared to either meeting or inconclusive in prior years. Some of these are actually reference sites, so we're pretty concerned about the fire impacts. The index score, they're not listed here, but they were as much as half the IBI score previously recorded, with loss of total taxa, decreased number of dipterans and caddisflies, in some cases complete loss of all sensitive EPT taxa. So there were some pretty severe impacts in places, but the results were kind of variable. The fire was spotty, even though it was 500,000 square acres. It was kind of spotty effect on the streams. We're continuing to do data collection through next spring, and then we'll finalize this report. My last slide is on our current research efforts, and intermittent streams compose another at least 5 to 10% of our stream miles in Arizona. So they're a really important water body. We would like to have some indices developed for intermittent streams. And a lot of these places they may be the only water for miles around, so they're important not only for aquatic life, but terrestrial life as well. We actually have data that's been collected in past years where we thought the stream was perennial, but later found out to be intermittent. So we had a pretty large data set. But in recent years, we did some flow monitoring and put sensors in streams to monitor presence or absence of flow in about a dozen stream sites, and did some biological collections in those streams to try to get a more discrete data set to work with. So with all of this past data, we actually hired David Richards with EcoAnalyst to help us kind of do some exploratory analysis and come up with an initial assessment tool for intermittent streams. So this looks really promising, and you can look forward to David's talk this afternoon. So a couple of the other things that we're doing, EPA's had a push to develop nutrient criteria with all the states. We're pursuing that in Arizona. We have been doing our macroinvertebrate work. We'll be looking at a periphyton index as well, percent algae macrophyte cover, as well as pH, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. So we're monitoring these things, and in particular looking at effluent-dependent waters, which we have several streams, mostly downstream of the large cities, which are discharging 100% effluent into dry riverbeds. So they're effluent-dependent streams that are kind of our most nutrient-enriched systems and characterize the very stressed endpoint of the nutrient gradient. So anyway, we're pursuing some research in that area. We're also doing some physical integrity work, looking at the relative bed stability measure. We're doing it a little bit different than the National River protocol, where we do a 100-count pebble count, and then we also do a bar or sub-pavement sample to calculate this. And we have a small grant-funded project and a consultant working on that with us. So we're hoping to put something together that will help us get a grip on sediment conditions and what is normal and how that's related to biological condition. Sediment is one of our biggest stressor in Arizona. In the perennial streams biocriteria area, we are looking to eventually migrate to reach-wide sampling approach. We also are very interested and have been interested in periphyton, so I'm very curious to follow up on California's work on that. We are evaluating the national rivers and streams protocols for potentially adopting more of those approaches. Lastly, we are very concerned about the crayfish problem in Arizona. This is our biggest biological stressor. It didn't show up in our probabilistic report because we don't have really good methods for measuring crayfish abundance. So that's something we're looking into, and we'll be hopefully incorporating that in the next year or two into our monitoring program. We have no native crayfish in Arizona, so where they're present, they really wreak havoc on the macroinvertebrate community. And that's all I have for you, the 3,000-foot level. Thank you.
Thanks for that talk. I was curious if you could expand a little bit on your non-perennial stream monitoring. If you could, what are you using different sampling index periods? Can you use your same methods, riffle versus multi-habitat approach? What have you been doing to collect that data? And how much data do you have? And how much information do you think you need to make some decisions on that front?
That's a pretty hefty question. Hopefully, David's talk this afternoon will address kind of the data set and the analyses that we're doing so far. But we have been using a multi-habitat approach. We initially collected some riffle samples, but for the more focused study over the past couple of years, did a multi-habitat or reach-wide sampling approach. And mostly because in those intermittent streams, you may not have much riffle habitat, so you need to be able to incorporate all the habitats present. We have stuck pretty close to all our other habitat sampling methods. We do a pebble count. We also use proper functioning conditions of riparian areas, a Fane-Cook channel stability index, a habitat index. That's sort of a revision or modification of the EPA visual-based habitat approach. Those are kind of the primary habitat things that we collect, and we've done some water chemistry as well. And then the flow, like I said, in the more focused study, we put some flow sensors in the stream that measured presence, absence of flow. And so we were able to get the number of days of flow for over the course of a year. So we're hoping to kind of calibrate and define the data sets going forward by the number of days of flow that are present, since obviously that's going to affect the type of community that's going to develop. So that's about all I could say about the protocols. And like I said, David will discuss that more this afternoon.
Hey, Patty, on the fire study, can you tell me what other things you're measuring, like flow, turbidity, other chemical measures, and are you planning to do follow-up to look at recovery, of some of the impacts that you've seen to the biological community?
Yeah, we did notice, we did measure some chemical parameters, and know that we saw short-term increases in some surprising parameters, like arsenic was one. Manganese, total Kaldol nitrogen, E. coli, total dissolved solids, percent fines, and of course canopy cover. So those were some things that we noticed were, decreased immediately in the first year post-fire. We're going to do monitoring again over the next 2 years. Well, sample this year and we'll sample again next year. In terms of follow-up, the best we can do is work with the Forest Service. So they're very interested in the work that we're doing, and most of this Wallow Fire area was in the Apache Sick-Reeves National Forest. So, they would be the one to follow up with restoration activities, and they already have some management going on already.
Thank you, Patty.
All right, thank you.